When I say iconic paintings, what are the first few that come to your head? Chances are that one of them will be the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. But why is this painting so famous? Is it really that great? Or is it famous for being famous? And if that's the case, then how did it get that famous? So let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Heidi from the Obsession podcast, and today the topic is the Mona Lisa and her unexpectedly weird rise to fame. And as usual, I'm going to be doing an illustration of the story, and you can join me if you like, because there's nothing better than talking and listening and drawing. The thing about iconic paintings, or really any iconic images really, is that they become a sort of visual cliche. And it's really hard sometimes to understand why they were considered such a big deal in the first place. And with time, we really lose the idea of what made them shocking or revolutionary, and the endless reproductions that we see in our everyday lives of this image just make them part of the furniture in our brains. About 80% of the current visitors to the Louvre in Paris do so with the sole intent of seeing the Mona Lisa, in spite of the fact that the Louvre is packed to the brim with masterworks. Now, is it because the Mona Lisa is that much better than the other works in the gallery? Is it because people report having profound emotional responses when looking at her? Is it because they like Dan Brown and have read the Da Vinci Code? And what do they think when they actually see her? Something that might shock you to know is that the Mona Lisa wasn't always a famous painting. The painting is around 500 years old, and it's only been really famous for a bit over 100 years. For centuries before that, it was appreciated by art critics and art historians, but the average person on the street with only a passing interest in art probably wouldn't have recognized her from a lineup of paintings, which now is kind of unbelievable. It really does feel like her face has always been in the public consciousness as this example of unquestionable genius and artistic perfection. In reality, even Leonardo da Vinci wasn't always held up as an intellectual superhuman like he is now. He was the very definition of a sad, washed up, former child prodigy, which, to be honest, actually makes me love him. Because I used to have this idea that he was always revered, and the more I research him, the more relatable he is. So Leonardo was disorganized, he was messy, and he was so unreliable when it came to finishing commissions that almost nobody wanted to hire him. He had so many interests that he would flip from one to the other, and look, people talk about this whole Renaissance man thing, but in reality, being good at a lot of things just means you get distracted a lot and you can't focus. And he got distracted a lot. At the age of 30, he was doing sketches of executed criminals because that was the only job he could get. It wasn't until the age of 46 that he painted The Last Supper, the painting that shot him into sudden fame and finally earned him the respect in the industry that he deserved. So, if you want proof of how much of a procrastinating perfectionist he was, the Mona Lisa took him 15 years, on again, off again, to complete. Now, even though in this episode we're going to be talking about the hype surrounding this painting, I'm not for a second saying that it isn't a brilliant work or that it doesn't deserve to be famous. And if you want to hear me analyze why I think the Mona Lisa really is a masterpiece, please listen to the Obsession podcast on Apple and Spotify, where I talk about it with Becky. So yeah, the Mona Lisa is incredibly brilliant, but like I said before, this is not exactly why she's famous. She is famous because of hype. When Leonardo died, he left it to his assistant and probable life partner, Celie, who sold it to King Francis I of France. It was kept in the French royal family until the French Revolution, when she was put in the Louvre. She then became the unlikely roommate of Napoleon Bonaparte when he decided that she should be hung in his bedroom. What a ladies' man! In 1804, she went to the Louvre, where she was basically just another painting in a room full of masterworks. There were some art historians who thought she was exceptional and important, but most people just thought she was a nice painting, if they thought about her at all. Now, this was to change in 1911, and the man who catapulted the Mona Lisa to international megastardom was a humble Italian tradesman by the name of Vincenzo Peruggia. As a young man of 20, Vincenzo had left the province of Varese in Italy to escape crushing poverty and ended up in France. He became a house painter in Paris until he fell ill with lead poisoning. Back then, being a house painter involved mixing pure lead paste with linseed oil, and it was common for men in this trade to experience serious health problems and even brain damage from exposure to lead. Vincenzo's second bout of lead poisoning put him in the hospital for 15 days, which means he would have had an enormous amount of contamination in his system. His behavior after this was erratic and unpredictable. Lead poisoning can shrink the prefrontal cortex of the brain and impair the ability to make careful decisions. That might account for the violent outbursts that put him in prison twice, once for public drunkenness and theft, and the other for brandishing a weapon and failing to show immigration papers. Vincenzo changed professions and began working for a glazier company called Gobier. He was good at his job and trusted by his bosses, but life was hard. His workmates put salt in his wine and called him sal macaroni, meaning dirty macaroni. The anti-Italian sentiment in France was very strong at the time, with an influx of Italian migrants that were escaping poverty and a suspicion that Italy might be going to side with Germany in the war that was brewing. Vincenzo was frequently beaten up in the streets and mocked for his rudimentary knowledge of the French language. He was a hard worker, but he couldn't win the respect of the men around him, who would call out sal macaroni, when he arrived for work each morning. Tired, lonely, and relentlessly bullied, Vincenzo was on the verge of a breakdown. Then, Gobier won a contract with the Louvre and Vincenzo was one of 5 Gobier workers sent to make glass casings for 16 of the museum's masterpieces. The director of the Louvre had commissioned these glass casings because of 2 incidents of vandalism on valuable paintings. Now, the Louvre was a very different place in the early 1900s. There were not even close to the amount of visitors that there are today, and security was lax. Most of the security guards were elderly pensioners who would fall asleep in their chairs and snore away beside the masterpieces that they were supposed to be protecting. There was a joke at the time that if you saw a vandal or a thief at the Louvre, please wake up a security guard. It was when Vincenzo was working at the museum that he noticed the amount of Italian paintings on display. And one day he picked up a guidebook and read about how Napoleon looted Italy, stealing many of the paintings that Vincenzo saw every day on the walls of the Louvre. And this filled him with rage. The bigotry and bullying he had received every day since coming to Paris had almost broken his spirit. But the knowledge that the Italian masterworks in front of him had been stolen gave him a fierce burst of patriotism and a determination to show everyone what a Sal Macaroni could do. At some point, he left his job at Gobier and went back to painting houses, but the anger remained. 8 months later, he had a plan. He was going to take an Italian masterpiece and return it to its homeland. He, Vincenzo Peruggia, would be hailed as a hero. On Monday, August the 21st, 1911, Vincenzo Peruggia got out of bed at 6 a.m. and put on the white smock that he had kept from his time working at the Louvre. The Louvre was closed for cleaning and maintenance on Monday, but at 7:05, Vincenzo was able to walk straight in, his white smock making him look like any other worker that would have access on a Monday morning. Now, there are many accounts that state that Vincenzo had shut himself in a cupboard the day before and stayed there all night, but Vincenzo himself refuted this, so we'll go with his story for this part. There are also accounts that he had 2 accomplices, but again, he always insisted that he carried out the heist alone. He entered the Salon Carré completely unnoticed and surveyed the wall of Italian masterworks in front of him. He chose the smallest and lightest painting simply because it was the smallest and the lightest. And yes, that painting was the Mona Lisa. He took her off the 4 metal hooks that she was hanging from, put her under his arm, and slowly walked towards a service staircase that he'd used many times when he was working there. He went down the small staircase and put the Mona Lisa on the landing with some student paintings that had been left there. He checked to see if he could get out through the service door, but it was locked. He took his screwdriver out of his pocket, removed the doorknob. Somehow this would supposedly help him unlock the door. I'm kind of confused about that part. Anyway, he heard footsteps coming towards him, and he sat down on the stairs and waited to be caught. However, the man coming towards him was a plumber who didn't recognize him and just saw a worker in a white smock. The plumber asked why the door was missing the knob, and Vincenzo just said he didn't know. The plumber fiddled around with the door, got it open, and closed it behind him. Vincenzo was still locked in. He went back upstairs where he had left the Mona Lisa, took her out of her frame and the glass casing, and this was very easy for him to do since he was the one who had made the casing. Then he removed his smock, wrapped up the unframed painting, and simply walked out of the building the same way he'd arrived. Nobody looked at him, nobody questioned him. When he was outside, he remembered that he had the doorknob in his pocket and threw it in the ditch between the fence and the wall of the Louvre. Then he got on a bus with the Mona Lisa under his arm, realized he was on the wrong bus, got off, hailed a horse and carriage, and went home. There are slightly differing versions to the story, one of them being the police report of the plumber. He claimed that he actually let Vincenzo through the door with him, and he was very upset that he'd accidentally been an accomplice in the heist. However, he'd also described Vincenzo as a tall, red-headed man with a beard, and since Vincenzo was 5'3" with dark hair and a large moustache and no beard, it's probable that the plumber was thinking of somebody else. But whatever happened during the heist, we do know that Vincenzo ended up safely at home with the Mona Lisa, and the staff of the Louvre remained oblivious of her absence for some time. For the next 26 hours, in fact. The next day, a painter who happened to have been working on a copy of the Mona Lisa came in with his easel and paints, only to see a ghostly rectangle and 4 metal hooks on the wall. So this painter goes up to a security guard and asks, "Hey, where did that Da Vinci painting go? I was working on that." And the guard just told him that the photographer had probably taken it to get new photos done for postcards or something like that. At some point, somebody does ask the photographer, who says that no, they were not photographing the Mona Lisa that day. That was when pandemonium finally ensued. Visitors were suddenly and quickly ushered out, the Louvre closed its doors, and the police were summoned. So now they have the top detectives on the job, and they have a list of suspects. One is a young man who used to frequently visit the Louvre to gaze besottedly at the Mona Lisa. It was thought that he might have fallen in love with her and taken her for himself, but that went nowhere. Then suspicion fell on none other than Pablo Picasso. Picasso, who was in Paris at the time, had bought statues that had previously been stolen from the Louvre. He insisted that he had no idea he'd purchased stolen goods and that he'd bought them from the assistant to the poet Apollinaire. So both Picasso and the poet Apollinaire were hauled in for questioning and only released when Picasso agreed to return the stolen statues. Detectives found the doorknob in the gutter and Vincenzo's fingerprints on the glass casing. Now, Vincenzo did have his fingerprints on file from his previous arrests, but matching all the fingerprints that the police had on file would have been a mammoth job, so they limited themselves to testing the prints of the current Louvre workers. In the meantime, the media and the public were exploding with what could only be called Mona Lisa mania. Newspaper headlines roared out, "Where is La Gioconda? An unimaginable!" People left flowers on the steps of the Louvre. Conspiracy theories were flying around. Was it an American millionaire? A German? The Kaiser? A week later, the Louvre reopened. Record numbers of visitors went through the door, only to go straight to the Salon Carré and stare at the 4 metal hooks and the empty rectangle where the Mona Lisa used to be. Yes, people who had probably never even heard of the Mona Lisa and most likely had never thought about going to see her before were now crowding into the Louvre to stare at a blank space on a wall. Her absence had suddenly made her very precious. And this wasn't only major news in France. The theft of the Mona Lisa hit headlines worldwide, with one American newspaper showing a photo of a completely different Da Vinci painting, which just kind of shows how little people actually knew about the painting at all. And where was she while all this hysteria was happening? I'll tell you where she was. She was propped up on a chair at the table in Vincenzo Perugia's tiny room. A police inspector did pay Vincenzo a visit, but he didn't search the room. Not even the cupboard above the bed where Vincenzo had hidden her behind pieces of firewood. An Italian migrant with a manual job did not fit the profile police were looking for. This was a high-class crime, obviously carried out by an educated, clever criminal. With all the media sensationalism and newly realized public love for the painting, Vincenzo decided that he couldn't go back to Italy until the hype had died down. He got on with life as usual, and for 2 whole years, he kept the Mona Lisa hidden in his room. Yes, just like Napoleon, the man he despised, Vincenzo had dragged La Gioconda into being his roommate. The irony! He kept her under his bed for a time, then made a custom crate for her that had a false bottom. A girlfriend he had had at the time claimed to have seen the painting, and a friend even claims that he looked after the Mona Lisa while Vincenzo was making the crate. So, Vincenzo writes to an antiques dealer in Florence called Alfredo Geri, and in his letter he states outright that he has the real, honest-to-goodness Mona Lisa and would Geri like to buy it. He signs it, Leonardo V. On December the 13th, 1913, he holds a goodbye dinner at a cafe for his friends and tells them that he is on a mission that will bring him fame and fortune. The next day, he puts the Mona Lisa in the crate, places the false bottom over her, then piles over her his clothes, his tools, and his mandolin. Then he catches the train to Florence. The crate is checked at the border, but they don't notice the false bottom, and Vincenzo is given the all clear. He checks into a hotel and goes straight to Alfredo Geri's gallery. He tells Geri that the Mona Lisa is in his hotel room and would he like to see. They engage in a bit of haggling, and Geri agrees that if this is the real Mona Lisa, then he'll pay 500,000 lira. He agrees to go to the hotel the next day. The next day, Geri took Giovanni Poggi, director of the Uffizi Gallery, with him to Vincenzo's hotel. Vincenzo opened up the crate, threw his clothes out onto the floor, lifted up the false bottom, and took out the painting. Poggi took her back with him to the Uffizi Gallery, where she was inspected and verified as the real deal. Then he called the police. Vincenzo was arrested and taken to prison. When the news broke that the Mona Lisa was in Italy, there was once again Mona Lisa mania. Vincenzo was seen as a hero, but he was in prison and he didn't get to enjoy the glory. Mona Lisa merchandise was being sold everywhere. The painting was exhibited in the Uffizi and more than 30,000 people went through the door in the first 4 hours. There was even a riot outside the gallery that was started by the people who couldn't get in. After a week, the Mona Lisa was sent back to Rome and handed in to the French ambassador. See, the saddest irony of all was that of all the paintings he could have chosen, Vincenzo took the one that was legally owned by France. So, if you'll remember, the French king, Francis I, bought it outright. So, it had to go back. Well, we know what happened to the Mona Lisa, but what happened to Vincenzo? So he was sentenced to 1 year and 15 days in prison, but he only served 7 months and 8 days. World War I broke out soon after his release and he went to war. He was captured and spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp in Austria. He did at some point return to Paris with his new wife, but he went under a new name because he wasn't actually allowed in France. And, of course, he took his wife to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa. Anyway, he died of a heart attack in 1929, just as his 2-year-old daughter, Celestina, was walking towards him, which is incredibly sad. And if you are more interested in this topic, there is a beautiful documentary on YouTube by First Hand Films called Mona Lisa is Missing, The Man Who Stole the Mona Lisa. And the film crew actually traveled to Italy to meet with Vincenzo's family, and his grandson retraces the steps in the Louvre and reenacts the heist. It's worth a watch, and it was one of the sources that really helped me with this episode. I'm going to finish off this drawing that I've started, and I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. And of course, once again, you can go to Spotify, Apple Podcasts to hear an extended version of this story. Please click like and subscribe. We are a newer podcast, so it would really help us. Thank you so much for joining me.